Good. Call to order the Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces of the House Armed Services Committee. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today for the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee hearing. As this is our first subcommittee hearing, I just want to say that I look forward to engaging all of our members on what I believe is the bipartisan committee in Congress. And I especially look forward to working with my ranking member colleague, Joe Courtney, and plotting a path forward to meet the requirements for our armed services. So, Joe, thanks again. Thanks for your service, and thanks for your leadership. Really appreciate that. 2 weeks ago, we held a classified briefing with Rear Admiral Wilson in regard to the Navy's 2016 Force Structure Assessment. The Force Structure Assessment assumed that the future plans for the Navy in ship types and numbers of ships would continue with ships of similar capacity that serve in the fleet today. This afternoon, we transitioned from looking at the Navy's Force Structure Assessment to considering 3 separate future fleet architecture studies. These 3 studies were directed by Congress and completed in recent months. These 3 fleet architecture studies take a different tack and consider what the composition of the fleet could be in the future. Some of their proposals include new ship classes, increased usage of unmanned vehicles, and redesigned ship configurations, just to name a few. We turn to 3 independent experts to provide more details on alternatives to the Navy's proposed force structure. I hope during the course of this hearing, we can discuss options that Congress could pursue to meet those Navy requirements. I think there is broad agreement with the Navy and the 3 independent studies on several themes. First of all, the Navy today is insufficient to address the challenges of tomorrow. I think everyone would agree that the 274 ships of the Navy fleet today are insufficient for a variety of reasons and lead to a variety of bad alternatives, including, most prominently, aircraft carrier gaps. I also believe there is general agreement that the future conflict will reside in a contested environment requiring additional large surface combatants and more robust weapons. Advancements in naval gunfire with the electromagnetic railgun and hypervelocity projectile are essential to getting on the right side of the cost curve. I also believe that all the studies agreed that the United States has an asymmetrical advantage in the undersea domain. Maintaining this advantage will require increasing the build rate of the Virginia attack submarine and introducing the Virginia payload module into the next block of attack submarines. While I believe the research and development community has done a great job with developing unmanned underwater vehicles, I also think it's time to down-select to specific systems and rapidly deploy these capabilities throughout the fleet. As to small surface combatants, I believe that there is general agreement on expanding the capabilities associated with a littoral combat ship. The Navy concluded a small surface combatant task force that determined the requirements for the frigate. However, I believe that we need to take a closer look at these requirements. I look forward to better understanding capabilities that our witnesses believe should be incorporated into the frigate. I also see our amphibious force with its complement of Marines as vital to the ability of our nation to deter aggression. As we look to rebuild our Navy, we must ensure that our Marine Corps also remains a large part of our plans. I look forward to hearing how the L-class ships that make up our amphibious readiness groups, our ARGs, can be used in the future. As to our preeminent strike capability, the aircraft carrier, I believe that there is general agreement that we need to expand this capability but continue to reduce costs associated with the Ford-class aircraft carrier. I do not believe any members of this subcommittee are willing to accept an almost $13 billion unit cost for the USS Gerald R. Ford, and efforts need to be taken to reduce overall cost. I look forward to options that our witnesses could offer to make the Ford class more affordable. And finally, I look forward to our witnesses better describing the communications challenges that are expected in a contested environment and options to address these concerns. I would like to welcome all of our members and the distinguished panel of experts we have with us today. This afternoon, we have with us Rear Admiral Jesse Wilson, Jr., Director, Assessment Division, OPNAV N81. Mr. Charles Werchado, Deputy Director, Assessment Division, OPNAV N81B. Bryan Clark, Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. and Dr. Sunoy Banerjee, MITRE Corporation. Thank you all for testifying today, and we look forward to your thoughts and insights on the fleet, architecture alternatives, and other critical pieces of information. I would now like to turn to our ranking member, Joe Courtney, for any remarks that he may have.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, congratulations on your selection as chairman of this committee, which, again, is a great committee. We've really made a difference over the years. Your long years of work on the committee, as well as your command of the subject, I think really make you the right guy for the job, and I look forward to working, as well as I think have a great team on both sides of the aisle, and obviously this could be a real sort of historic year given the topic that we're going to discuss this afternoon. It is the question of the day, is obviously the force structure assessment that was produced last year, and obviously all the force architecture work that these witnesses were involved in. So in an effort to sort of get to the heart of the matter, I have opening remarks, which is in writing. I'm going to ask that it be submitted for the record, and again, let's just jump right into it and hear from our great witnesses. Yep.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Courtney. We'll now go to our witnesses, begin with Rear Admiral Wilson. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Courtney, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the future fleet architecture studies that were conducted in accordance with the FY16 National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA. 3 independent studies for a future fleet architecture in the 2030 timeframe were conducted, and the leads of each team are here today to brief the findings of their studies. The Navy-led project team, MITRE's National Security Engineering Center, and the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. These studies are a starting point in the analysis that the Navy will use to develop our future fleet architecture and design. None of them, including the Navy project team study, has been endorsed by the Chief of Naval Operations as a comprehensive solution set to focus our future fleet development. We will continue to incorporate what we have learned from them into our ongoing research and development and rapid fielding, our wargaming, experiments, concept development, and strategic thinking. They will contribute to the high-velocity learning that is necessary to strengthen our naval power to outpace our peer competitors and future threats. All 3 studies were based on a 2030 strategic environment defined by the reemergence of great power competition and the growing availability of high-end warfighting capabilities designed to counter U.S. military advantages. While each entity conducted its study independently, generated its own assumptions, and performed its own analysis, several common themes emerge across the 3 studies. We are examining these themes and ideas thoroughly. Some of the recommendations in the studies will be acted upon, or acted upon more quickly than was already being planned. Some recommendations show promise and will need further analysis and exploration. These studies are part of a larger effort to inform and focus our future fleet development efforts in order to identify the most promising insights from each study for inclusion in our future force plans and capability decisions. Further analysis will need to be conducted, informed by both the studies and future operational concepts, to determine optimum fleet size, mix, and required resourcing over time. The Navy looks forward to working with the Congress and others to achieve the maritime superiority the nation needs today and in the future in order to defend the American people and promote global security and prosperity. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Rear Admiral Wilson. Thanks so much for your opening statement. Mr. Werchado?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senior Ranking Member Courtney, and distinguished members of the panel. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the results of the Navy Project Team Future Fleet Architecture Study. I led the project team with participants from across the Navy as the Senior Navy Analyst and not as the Deputy of the Assessment Division. This is not an official Navy study. It was independent by design and does not represent an official Navy position. Although this study is focused on the architecture of a future fleet, it also explores how that fleet might be used, including alternative concepts of operations. The study was conducted with the goal of defeating a near-peer competitor with a robust anti-surface capability while also deterring another threat actor in any theater. The project team designed a distributed fleet architecture which would allow the Navy of the future to accomplish its missions, providing strong and sustained forward presence to influence geopolitical events, respond to crises, reassure allies, and deter potential aggressors. The distributed fleet was conceived to deliver decisive combat power as part of a joint force to defeat U.S. adversaries if deterrence fails. It was developed as an asymmetric response to adversaries' increasing reconnaissance strike capabilities that can find, track, and target our centers of gravity, including large naval formations. By distributing our firepower, we challenge the enemy with up to 10 times the number of combat nodes that can strike them and attack axes against which they have to defend. The distributed fleet would encompass a widely dispersed, robust network of air, surface, and subsurface platforms capable of delivering both kinetic and non-kinetic effects, employing 3 mutually supporting concepts of operations: distributed fleet lethality, electromagnetic maneuver warfare, and distributed agile logistics. The distributed fleet would enable a greater reliance on strikes from combat nodes beyond the carrier strike group, freeing more carrier air wing assets to focus on surveillance, targeting, and electronic attack. The robust information sharing environment enables us to engage enemy platforms before they can attack, reducing defensive weapons requirements and allowing more offensive weapons to be deployed. Priority was given to long-range weapons for sea control in a contested area, as well as multi-mode weapons capable of striking a variety of targets to maximize mission flexibility and ship loading. The concept would deploy unmanned air vehicles extensively on platforms to give ships the ability to conduct organic targeting at long range, employing advanced weapons, something the current fleet cannot do. It would also call for the development and fielding of armed unmanned surface vehicles transported by and deployed from ships that have well decks to further distribute shooters within the theater. Additionally, the concept would expand the use of unmanned underwater vehicles to provide theater commanders with the ability to deploy sensors and weapons into areas that are currently denied. Accelerating development and fielding the capabilities for electromagnetic maneuver warfare allow the future Navy to deliver the assured communications that's required to net the fleet and enable kill chains while reducing our dependence on military satellites. It will also accelerate the fielding of key capabilities to counter adversary surveillance and targeting systems, improving fleet survivability, and deliver improved electronic warfare systems to better protect both ships and aircraft. Finally, distributed agile logistics enables the distributed fleet by sustaining combat operations in a contested environment. The U.S. Navy has not had to do this since World War II. It shifts reliance from vulnerable shore bases to more survivable afloat and expeditionary hubs. It would also improve the Navy's ability to conduct maintenance and reload weapons at sea. Given the service life of today's ships and aircraft, 75% of the fleet today will still be operating in the year 2030. Adding to the years or even decades required to design, build, and field new platforms, the Navy must look beyond fleet architecture to new operational concepts to rapidly address and defeat emerging threats. Implementing the distributed fleet represents a far greater opportunity to effect change. Increasing lethality can be achieved by distributing strike forces, including unmanned. Maneuver warfare provides an assured network and communication system able to provide robust kill chains while denying the enemy their targeting. These distributed lethal nodes make every platform a sensor, shooter, or communicator, or some combination of the 3. The Navy meets current and anticipates future threats and will continue to innovate, adapt, fight, and win. This study developed the new concept, the distributed fleet, as a fleet design architecture to beat the future threat. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Werchado. Now go to Mr. Clark.
Chairman Whitman, Ranking Member Courtney, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for having us here today to testify on this very important and timely subject, as you mentioned. I wanted to make 5 main points regarding the fleet architecture study that we conducted at CSBA. First, as Admiral Wilson mentioned, great power competition is going to be the defining feature of the security environment that we're looking at here, which is the 2030s. China and Russia already have the desire to pursue objectives in their near abroad and accrete influence and territory, and in that time frame, they're likely to have the capabilities to be able to pursue those objectives with a pretty high degree of aggression. We're also going to face regional powers that have the ability to use the capabilities that great powers might convey to them, like long-range missiles and long-range surveillance systems, and exploit their geographic advantage. So you think about a country like an Iran or a country like a North Korea, their geographic position combined with longer-range weapons and sensors enables them to punch above their weight, if you will. The second point is the emergence of this great power competition is going to put the onus on us to deter conflict with those great powers. A great power war, if we think about historically, could have damaging and potentially catastrophic consequences for ourselves and for the global economy as well as our allies. So we're going to have to think about deterring those kinds of conflicts and not just fighting them. If we get into a position of having to fight a China or fight a Russia in a large-scale conflict, then we've probably signed ourselves up for a very damaging set of consequences. The fleet architecture that you would need to deter those potential adversaries is a little bit different potentially than what you might use if you were simply looking to fight them in some kind of scenario that we develop arbitrarily in advance. So we got to think about how a fleet architecture is prepared to deter conflict, and then if deterrence fails, shift to be able to actually fight that conflict. And those might be two different things, so we need to carefully think about that. The third main point is because of this and because the objectives of these adversaries, if you think about the Baltics for Russia or Taiwan for China or the Senkaku Islands for China, they're all relatively close to those countries. They're all relatively close at hand, and it wouldn't take very long for them to begin an act of aggression against them and even culminate it before U.S. forces and those of our allies would be able to arrive to stop them. So our forces, our naval forces in particular, are going to have to be able to persist, survive, and then fight in these highly contested environments near the adversary's territory, thinking about the South and East China Seas when it comes to China, or potentially the Baltic, or certainly the North Atlantic when it comes to Russia. This is going to drive us, and as my fourth point, to new operational concepts and new capabilities that enable our forces to be able to survive in these high-threat environments. This gets to ideas like Mr. Werchado brought up of distributed forces, new concepts for electromagnetic maneuver warfare and undersea warfare that enable us to operate inside environments where the adversary can find us relatively easily and certainly attack us with large salvos of missiles. So new concepts are necessary for that, and we need to equip the force to be able to conduct those operational concepts. And that's in large part what our study was designed to do, is describe that. Our force packages that emerge from those operating concepts are designed to be able to combine manned and unmanned systems, autonomous unmanned systems, and those in manned platforms to be able to conduct long-range sensing or counter-ISR operations and conduct long-range strike with a distributed force that allows a force with a large number of distributed platforms to be able to have the same kind of firepower as we would get from a traditional carrier strike group, for example. The fifth point I want to bring up is that this more improved fleet and the fleet that's capable of deterring great power conflict in the 2030s is going to be larger than today's fleet and more expensive. Our study found that the 340 to 380 ship Navy we believe we need is going to cost 15 to 20% more to buy, to maintain and operate, and to man than today's fleet. So we need to be prepared for the fact that entering into a great power competition and being able to win or at least sustain an advantage in that competition is going to be more expensive. And so I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Dr. Banerjee, want to welcome you here today. I know that your wife and your mother has accompanied you today. Want to welcome you all too. So, mother-in-law, I'm sorry, mother-in-law, gotcha. We'll get it straight. My apologies. But Dr. Banerjee, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome, and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Whitman, Ranking Member Courtney, and distinguished members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the findings and recommendations of the MITRE's future fleet architecture. Congress directed the Secretary of Defense to perform 3 independent studies of alternative fleet, future fleet
Dr. Banerjee, if I could get you to move the mic just a little bit closer to you.
Sure.
It's a big room. We want to make sure everybody can hear you.
Sorry.
Thank you. No problem.
Alternative future fleet platform architectures for the Navy in the 2030 timeframe. The MITRE Corporation's National Security Engineering Center and FFRDC was asked to deliver one of the 3 studies. MITRE conducted the study over a 4-month period and delivered the final report consisting of a 70-page unclassified report and a 30-page classified annex on July 1st, 2016. MITRE recommended a 322-ship fleet in 2030 built around 3 major themes. The first, improving missile defense capabilities through the fielding of the hypervelocity projectile in the existing 5-inch deck guns in the surface force, and an aerial layer missile system to be deployed within the carrier air wings to deal with more advanced missile threats. Our preliminary campaign modeling suggests these two innovations significantly improve the survivability of the naval force. Second, improving the long-range strike through fielding of new supersonic cruise missiles and ballistic missile capabilities into the surface and submarine force. These capabilities enable the naval force to project power into, while the carrier force is maneuvering into striking range for the carrier air wing. Third, increase force size while controlling costs via a high-low mix of platforms. The MITRE analysis recommended a missile defense innovations to improve the effectiveness of the existing surface force through a mix of Aegis surface combatants, which is the high end, a new fast frigate design built around the hypervelocity projectile in the 5-inch deck guns. That's the medium end capability. And the low end is a magazine ship. So this is a container ship that has large numbers of VLS cells and to augment the existing magazines and capacity of the surface force. The cost savings from these alternative mixes of platforms were used to buy an additional 5 Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines, which is be a high-end capability, and 14 air-independent propulsion attack submarines, which would be a conventional submarine that would be a medium-end capability to significantly increase the size of the surface force, or the submarine force. The study tasking emphasized the numbers and types of ships and submarines needed by the future force. However, this force also requires new sets of weapons, sufficient number of modern aircraft, resilient C4I systems, integration of both kinetic and non-kinetic effects, and undersea enablers to be effective. A balanced investment across not only shipbuilding, but all these other additional factors is required for the naval force to improve both its capacity and its capability to deter aggression in the future. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. We'll now go to Mr. Courtney to begin our questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony this afternoon. Again, obviously, there's a lot of overlap in terms of the different studies that all of you conducted, as well as Admiral Richardson's force structure assessment. And, you know, obviously, we live in a different sort of realm in terms of increments of 1-year budget cycles and 2-year terms. And so, you know, when we're looking at a target of 2030 to get to the numbers, which, again, let's just sort of stipulate you all have the same number at the end of the day. If you were sort of advising Congress in terms of a short-term, you know, to-do list, you know, mid-term, middle-term, or medium-term to-do list, and a long-term, as far as, you know, how we get there, and I just would sort of, in terms of where we focus, you know, our authorizations and appropriations, I think that would be very helpful for the members here to just kind of, like I said, focus it in terms of the task ahead in terms of the Congress. And again, anyone wants to jump in first or just go right across the table, whatever you're comfortable with.
Ranking Member Courtney, I will start. Let me first say that we've already talked about the force structure assessment in the 355-ship Navy that directed, or the results of that study resulted in. To accelerate to a point that we feel we need to get to in the future fleet architecture, 3 studies, the results from them. There are ongoing efforts right now to build a path to accelerate with existing industrial-based capacity that we know we can already ramp up with. And that information will be coming out soon. So we know we need to grow the force. We know we need to grow it to 355 right now with existing platforms and ways of fighting. So to get the rudder over, so to speak, we will start building a path to start ramping up as rapidly as we can where we know we can get started right away.
Thank you. Ranking Member Courtney, and Mr. Chairman, in the interest of domestic harmony, I'd like to point out that my lovely wife is here as well. Sir, my recommendation would be to go for a capability over platform. Naval weapons have gotten so long range, so precise, and so lethal that in hundreds of studies that Admiral Wilson and I run a year for the Navy, what really comes out strongly is that it's the battle of the first salvo. Naval forces, by their nature, are mobile, and therefore they have to be targeted to be hit. And so whichever side completes that target and kill chain first and fires first almost always wins. So I would make my investments in counter C4ISR. Where's our decoy ship? Where's our electronic warfare to create false targets? Let's make us hard to find while we make ourselves more capable of finding them. I think if we make the investments in the counter C4ISR realm, they're going to be higher payoff first. We have lots of cruise missiles. We can use them. We have lots of VLSLs on the combatants. But we need to be able to complete the targeting chain to make them effective.
Congressman, a couple of things I'd say in the near term are, just like Mr. Werchado was saying, we need, though, to invest in the unmanned vehicles that are going to be the things that carry around these payloads of counter C4ISR systems or sensors to be able to enable things like distributed lethality. So investing in and buying new extra large unmanned undersea vehicles, buying new large unmanned surface vehicles, the common USV and also the extra large USV, which may be a variant of the DARPA Sea Hunter program. Those are going to be the platforms that carry around some of these sensor packages and some of the jammers and decoys that we're going to need to deploy in order to keep platforms inside these highly contested environments. The other thing we can do in the near term is to accelerate construction of those ships that are already in construction where there is additional margin available. So accelerating LXR as the Congress is already moving toward, accelerating perhaps the next LHA, and then in addition to that, we're going to have to make some investments in the shipyards in order to enable them to further increase production. In particular, if you think about Electric Boat up in Connecticut, they're largely going to be maxed out in terms of their near-term industrial capacity with the Columbia class, and if we try to do 2 attack submarines. But they have workforce limitations that are going to keep them from growing further. There's some facilities constraints that just over time that have grown and need to be addressed. So putting some money into facilities and a training infrastructure so that the shipyards are going to be able to bring on the workforce they need to grow in order to start doing the construction at the rate that we would need to get to a 350 ship or so Navy. And then in the midterm, I think the key will be to facilitating the Navy being able to create the kind of network infrastructure it's going to need for these unmanned vehicles with the sensors and the counter sensors to be able to talk to each other and then also talk back to their manned platforms that are controlling them. And so investments in some of the new line of sight data links, improvements to Link 16 that are currently making their way into the program of record, those are going to be essential in order for us to make our forces able to talk to one another in an environment where it's going to be highly contested, lots of jamming, loss of GPS is likely. So Link 16 in particular, I think, is a capability that we need to continue to enhance, and there's more room to grow for it.
I'd just like to elaborate on what Mr. Werchado said. I think that in the past, it's always been, the one who strikes first does the most damage. One of the things we were looking at is the hypervelocity projectile, railgun, and the aerial missile system to provide us the capability to actually absorb that first hit, minimize the damage to the force, and then enable us to have a counterstrike that's both powerful and can deliver a powerful blow to the adversary. So in terms of things that can be done in the near term, further maturation of the hypervelocity projectile, integrating new seeker heads into that. If we're looking at actually deploying railguns on ships, when we think about new ship designs, how do we get the 24 megajoules of wall plug power so you can fire that thing continuously as opposed to having to charge it off of a capacitor? Development and maturation of the aerial layer missile system that can be deployed on either an F-18 or the new F-35Cs or even the Marine Corps F-35 Bravos to be able to provide a long-range ability to intercept really advanced hypersonic threats that are coming in towards the naval force. That also is going to require an ability to target those types of weapons and systems at range and the battle management capability to be able to coordinate those types of engagements. I think in the midterm, building platforms and that can actually hold those capabilities and operate them in the manner we think we're going to have to fight would be the second piece. And to the extent that we can leverage work that's already been done, if there are designs that are available that other navies have that we can quickly leverage and deploy, or leverage existing designs for AIP submarines that we can license and then actually build here at U.S. shipyards to get the numbers and the capacity that we need in the midterm.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All of you have mentioned many of the same things as a part of your studies, whether it's weapons and or connectivity or command and control or whatever it might be. where are the long poles in the tent for getting all of that done? The 2030 array of 240 or 340, whatever the number of ships you've got, assume a rational progression across all those lines of things to be developed. Where are the ones that are most likely to give us the most head scratching or the most trouble trying to keep up with all the other things? If we could put the hulls in and the keels down, you could do that pretty mechanically. But all the other stuff you're talking about, where are the choke points across that array of stuff?
So I'll jump in there, but one thing that in particular we're finding trouble with is battle management. And so you can have great data links to be able to communicate with all your unmanned vehicles, and they can be off-sensing the environment. You can have all these weapons, but the problem is that the speed of conflict is going to happen so quickly that I need something autonomous to be able to look at a threat, decide what it is, decide what the best weapon is to address it, and then where that weapon is, be able to send it from that platform to address the threat, or on the other side, attack a target that maybe is amenable to a particular kind of weapon, but not other kinds of weapons. But having the battle management to be able to coordinate all that information coming in and then be able to make a decision as to what to do about it autonomously is a key capability that there's been lots of projects going individually on, but there's not been really anything that's totally cracked that nut.
So if you can't do that, then you have to have more ships because you got to take you have to have losses associated with unable to do that. Where's the break point? Your assessment assumes that gets done. If it doesn't happen, how many more ships do you have to have?
So in our assessment, we were pretty conservative with regard to our ability to do autonomous battle management. Right. So our fleet in some respects reflects the fact that you're going to need more manned platforms to control unmanned systems that are operating, somewhat independently of you. If you could get more autonomy in your battle management system, if you think about Aegis system that automatically does decision making for you, if you had that and they were able to apply it across a whole force, you might be able to reduce the number of manned platforms significantly. Down from 350 to somewhere in the lower 300s range.
What about on the weapons side, the railgun, directed energy, those things? Where's the?
Sir, that one, if I can talk to that, we're really taking a tool track approach. Right now, there's over 100 barrels in the fleet that can fire an HVP, and Dahlgren's working together with the Army, and they're coming along well in the testing. That one can be fielded very quickly. Railgun is going to be a lot longer. We have to solve a lot of problems, barrel wear, repetitive rate, as you mentioned, the recharge. So I think the low-hanging fruit is to get HVP out as fast as we can. It does really well against cruise missiles. It probably doesn't take down a ballistic missile, but it would be a huge benefit to us to be able to have an inner zone cruise missile defense. One thing Bryan alluded to is the command and control. We have to assume that every time we go out, we're going to get jammed. We might have people take out our satellites. It's always going to be a contested environment. At a minimum, there'll be cyber attacks against our unclassed networks. So we should only train in areas where we can fight through a limited data. So bringing UAVs to do our own comms links, do our own surveillance, doing that organically is going to be huge.
Mr. Banerjee, Doctor, other things that aren't yet, that are just wishes, that are still a long development process?
I agree that, the battle management to be able to sort out and make the target weapon pairing, and I think the challenge is how do you do that in a highly contested environment, and I guess I would say the cyber threat. I think there are ways of getting around the jamming, and depending on how denied space is through line of sight relays and other capabilities. I think the long pole in the tent is how to do that in a highly contested cyber environment. I think that was a big concern that we had when we were doing the study, and part of the reason we had the classified annex to talk to what were some of the threats and how do you actually build a resilient architecture to try to deal with some of those threats.
Chairman, yes, sir. Dr. Admiral Wilson.
Yes, sir. I do want to mention an effort that's ongoing as we speak. So right now at the Center of Naval Analysis, we have a wargaming tabletop exercise ongoing, and it incorporates representatives from all three study teams, the Marine Corps, and several other key stakeholders to really look at what are the long poles in the tent as we look across these three future fleet architecture studies, and also to identify those key enablers that we will need to fight in various scenarios and theaters as it relates to each separate study. And we're going to be doing some red teaming. And several of the people here will also be in the room as well. And so yesterday was the first day. And so we got a clear indication of the cooperation and kind of the open-mindedness that we have in discussing these types of issues. And we think we're going to get a lot of fruit out of that. We'll be able to come back and tell you the results.
No, I look forward to, that's the exact kind of, I mean, it sounds great. So thank you. You're back.
Thank you, Mr. Conaway. And I will now go to Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for being here. I've been dealing more in personnel these last number of years, so this is very interesting, but it just takes a while to get it all, and I want to just thank you for speaking English for most of the time. I appreciate it. I think, Mr. Werchado, you made the statement, I believe, something to the effect that the Navy would have written this differently, perhaps focused on different things, and Admiral, you might speak to this as well. How? In what way? I mean, do you think that your experiences are lending a different, these reports are lending a whole different view to what is required and what kind of capacity we have to deal with it today versus down the line?
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the question. I'd say that the only difference would have been because I was, and my team, we were given intellectual freedom to look at the range of possibilities. And we aren't geniuses. Distributed lethality was proposed by SURF 4 2 years ago. We just expanded it to all the fleet versus just the surface ships. I think what would have happened if it was an official Navy study is it would have been chopped by the surface community, the submarine community, the aviators, the Marines, and everybody would have said, I don't play enough in it. So we had the freedom to not vet it. I don't think there was any new brilliant ideas that came out of it, but we were able to say, what's the most effective force to fight a high-end threat, not what's the balanced equal opportunity force.
Yeah. And part of it, too, is the parochialism, which sometimes tends to seep into the discussion. Admiral, yes? You smiled when I said that.
I agree with what Mr. Werchado said. Now, although he had representatives across all those resource sponsors, I think the nature of the culture that he developed in his study team is that, hey, you know, leave your badge at the door, and we're going to be open-minded about this. And not only that, the NDAA specified that they weren't, encumbered to anchor themselves on programs of record, so they didn't have to, incorporate anything.
How
that was
confident are you then that as we move forward that those kinds of recommendations will come forward as opposed to having people fall back on some of the other ways that...
No, ma'am, I'm very comfortable that we will get kind of the honest assessment. Matter of fact, in the assessments division, that's kind of our job, to be the honest brokers on how things should be assessed throughout the building cycle of how the Navy resources.
Right. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, as a former employee of the Entity 1 Assessments Division, I can attest to, they do very good work in there, but in some ways in the Navy, you're constrained by what it is that the Office of the Secretary of Defense is going to use to grade your homework. So when you send your recommendations up in terms of the budget, they have a set of scenarios and objectives that they are going to grade that against. And so if we, as a department, have established a set of requirements that are maybe not reflective of what the future might really hold, then we may be going down the wrong path in terms of our force structure decisions. And so by doing it this way, you sort of freed the teams to come up with their own assessment of what we think the future operating environment's going to be and what may be required of naval forces. So at least you get a better idea of what I guess the operating space might be, like how big a fleet, what kind of fleet, what mix of fleet might be necessary to address the future operating environment.
Do you think that how we prioritize the ships and capabilities would be different under that? I mean, there's such a range that we're talking about, and we obviously don't have unlimited funds.
I think the priorities would be different.
Uh-huh.
But I think that there is a fairly limited range of fleet architectures that make sense, given the kind of great power competition we're going to face. And it all kind of comes down to specifics with regard to, am I looking to deter a certain kind of conflict or fight a different kind of conflict? So it kind of comes down to exactly what the instantiation of that future threat might be, but there's bounds on it.
I wonder, Doctor, do you see the flexibility in what we're looking at as well, because we never can quite predict that next war?
Yeah, as Brian said, that's always the challenge, and I think that's also compounded by the fact that with ships, they're 30 to 50-year hulls. So even though we're looking out to 2030, I think Mr. Werchado mentioned this at the kickoff the war game, about 75% of the force that's going to be there in 2030 is kind of the same ships and hulls that we have today. So the challenge is, how do you adapt that force over time to meet these advanced threats and these new challenges within the constraints of the fact that the vast majority of the force that you're going to have in the future is very similar to what you have today. So it's a complex problem.
Yeah. Admiral, did you quickly?
Yes, ma'am. I did want to add one additional point. Although there were 3 separate studies, across the table here, there's not a lot of difference in the DNA of the groups here. Brian even mentioned he used to be in 81, and so although we're getting different kind of opinions and ways of fighting, we are also casting a wider net to what else is out there. There are things that didn't show up in any of the 3 studies, new technologies that we get from industry or from academia that may be beneficial and help us as well. So we are looking at those things also.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mrs. Davis. We'll now go to Mr. Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go back a little bit to, I sit on Science, Space, and Technology. We talk about a couple of these things, but one of them is hypersonic weapons. And we've been talking about hypersonic for about 65 years in America. And we seem to start a program, stop a program, start a program, stop a program, collect data, give data to somebody else, wait for the Chinese to steal it, and then that's kind of where we are. I would like that to stop. And I know that the Navy, we've had several admirals in here before that have talked about hypersonic weapons and what a kind of a game changer that would be. I understand HVP is helping quite a bit, but that doesn't get us to moving somebody way away because you are now going 4,800 miles an hour. So give me an idea. And I know that we have problems with the railgun, and I think that we will continue to have problems with the railgun for a very long time, just because of the nature of what we were working there, and maybe we're just not quite smart enough to get through the physics of what the railgun brings to us. So give me an idea of where we are, what that would mean to our fleets. I think I know what that would mean to the Air Force, but I also know that that would probably bring a greater issue to the Navy than any of the 4 services. So I'll start with the Admiral.
Yes, sir. I concur with your comments. I particularly kind of locked on how we talk in open forum. And one of the key words that we talked about at the very beginning was this is a competition. And when you're in high-level competition, you're very careful as to what information you give your adversary. And so we do need to think more about how we do that in the future and not talk about what we can't do and what we cannot do and let the adversaries know kind of where we're at.
Sir, I'd like to address a particular aspect. You mentioned the different weapons and their capabilities. Radar resources plays a huge part. I think everybody here is aware of the Navy's effort for AMDR, Advanced Missile Defense Radar, on the Flight 3 DDG. Appreciate all the support that program's gotten to date, and we look forward to using that against future threats, including hypersonic.
So I would add to that one thing that U.S. naval forces have as an advantage potentially is that you are co-locating your missile defenses with the target. So if the hypersonic weapon is coming at you and you are on the ship and you've got some defensive systems, you can still shoot at it because it's still got to eventually come to you. And so the fact that the hypersonic weapon's going Mach 5 or beyond is somewhat mitigated by the fact that it has to eventually arrive at your location. So some of these missile defense capabilities that might be very difficult to use in defense of somebody else are somewhat effective when you're dealing with getting shot at yourself. The other thing we have to think about is us using hypersonic weapons against the enemy, and there's been a lot of work going on in development of new hypersonic weapons that U.S. forces could use, and so that's where I think we should be investing more time and effort, because clearly if we're worried about the threat coming from Russia or China, there's no reason why we wouldn't be able to develop our own hypersonic threat, whether it's air-launched or potentially even surface-launched, ship-launched.
And thank you, Brian. That's exactly where I was going to go. In the MITRE study, we recommended an aerial air missile system. So that was, actually a hypersonic terminal seeker to be able to deal with some of the hypersonic threats that are coming in and trying to engage them at range, and potentially even at longer range engage those platforms that are going to be launching large numbers of anti-ship cruise missiles and other things coming at us. So our report talked about how through the aerial layer, and then also we talked about a Pershing 3 variant. So the DF-21 missile is based off of the Pershing 2. That's an example of where they've taken our design and used it against us. The thought here is have a Pershing 3 variant that could be launched from a ship, so we can still comply with the INF treaty, but that would be now something that they would have to deal with, and now they'll have to build defensive systems to try to figure out how they're going to save their little atolls in the South China Sea or their ships.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Knight. We're just looking. There's a vote that's been called, so we're going to try to get through a few more questions here. What's that? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. We're going to go Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for the witnesses, a big thank you. Like Ms. Davis, a lot of this is new. I've been on other subcommittees, mostly on strategic arms. Some of it seems to intersect here. Of particular interest to me is the unmanned vehicles of various kind, underwater, surface, and the like. Mr. Werchado, you seem to be enamored by these. I'd like you to explain more completely why and how they fit into the battlefield. And also in this context, maybe all of you would like to comment on the near term, all of which all of you seem to comment on requires defense, electrical, magnetic defenses, cyber warfare, and the like. So if you can hit both of those, it'd be helpful to me.
Yes, sir. Be glad to. It was not a pleasant moment, but I had an IPR, a progress report, with our mutual boss, Admiral Richardson, and I used that comment about 75% of the force still being here in 2030, and he said, only if I keep buying the same things. And he challenged us to see how different we could make our force by 2030. And you know what? You really can't do that through just manned systems. If you want to build things quickly, they have to be affordable, and unmanned is a great way to get there. So we said, if we open the aperture, what could we do? So we gave ourselves some constraints. We couldn't invent a new unmanned platform that didn't exist. It had to be either in development or based on a current manned platform. So we said, what do we need to do? We need to have a backup to satellites. So we said, what kind of surveillance could we provide? And we looked at what DARPA was working on. They had turn, excellent capability. So we put that on all the surface combatants. We want to make ourselves more offensive. So we looked at the Mark 6 patrol boat, said, easy to make that into a robot boat. We can put 4 cruise missiles on it without exceeding its displacement. So now we have 4 times the strike capability. So we went for niche unmanned capabilities where we needed it. We wanted to have the decoy. I don't want a manned ship to be the decoy because it'll get shot. I use unmanned vehicles, unmanned surface vehicles for the decoys. So we went after niche capabilities where unmanned was better than manned, and the technology supported it.
I'd say, sir, in addition to what Mr. Werchado just talked about, we looked at using unmanned systems as an adjunct to manned systems because they're going to be able to give you that longer reach and the greater persistence and operate in environments where you might need to depend on them to be your eyes and ears, if you will. So large unmanned vehicles like Mr. Werchado talked about were essential. A couple of limitations, though, we found in the work we've been doing with DARPA is one is the sensor capability that an unmanned vehicle has is usually pretty limited compared to a manned platform, because we want these unmanned vehicles to be relatively small and relatively inexpensive, so we don't put the very sophisticated sensors on them. That means that the brains in them, the autonomy, isn't necessarily always going to be able to make the right decision because it may not be able to see what's going on around it. So you got to network them together to have maybe one with a really good sensor and others that are be able to talk to it, but that means you got to have those communications that are sometimes highly contested in these environments. And then the other thing with unmanned vehicles, when you think about deterrence and in peacetime, how you might use them, is they don't necessarily provide the deterrent effect that you're looking for in terms of preventing conflict. Not necessarily because people don't respect them because there's no people on them, but more so because they can't defend themselves. So if you're driving around the South China Sea and you run up against a unmanned Mark 6 patrol boat, you can't have it just start shooting at people that happen to wander up to it, because in peacetime that's not appropriate. So it limits your ability to deter conflict in peacetime if you depend entirely on an unmanned solution.
I think all three reports, MITRE report agreed that unmanned, I think, has a huge role on the undersea side, and we were all for having unmanned underwater vehicles as a critical enabler. I think our report differed from the others in the sense that we de-emphasized the role of unmanned on the surface and on the air side. I think there's a role for it in the air wing that needs to be worked out, but our concerns were, again, from a counter C4ISR perspective and a counter space perspective, to what degree are you going to be able to actually network these types of platforms together and use them effectively? And then our other concern was from a cyber perspective, how well are these platforms going to work in a highly contested cyber environment? And so MITRE made a conscious decision to kind of de-emphasize the unmanned on the surface and the air side to some extent in our report.
Yes. What's that? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to now go to Mr. Desjardins. Thank you.
I know we just have a minute before we have to leave for votes. I have a quick question. I'll start with Dr. Werchado.
Well, go ahead and take your full 5 minutes. We're going to have some folks coming back, so we're going to keep the hearing going.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
feel free to take your full 5 minutes.
Some advocates have indicated a high-low mix of attack submarine assets to include diesel submarines. What are the pros and cons associated with a high-low mix of attack submarines?
Thanks, sir. Excellent question. I had the fortune to be on the Virginia-class analysis of alternatives back in the 90s, and we did look at diesels. The problem is we don't have the luxury of fighting close to our shore. We play an away game. And if I was a country like China, I would buy a lot of diesels because I know you're going to come and fight me near home. We have to deploy, and the only way to deploy is to bring your own fuel with you. When we buy a Virginia, it comes with a lifetime of fuel. And so I have nothing against diesel submarines, but you have to say, I'm going to be fighting within a few hundred miles of where I base them, or else now I have to buy extra oilers. I'm going to make them vulnerable when I refuel them. They're going to have to snorkel. They're going to become vulnerable. It's just not an option for us as long as we have to be a global Navy.
Yeah. Did anybody else have a comment, Doctor?
I'll take that. So MITRE put that into the report. Our concern was on the capacity side and actually bringing up the number of attack submarines. I think Mr. Werchado pointed out, the diesels are going to have issues with speed of advance and magazine depth. They don't have the magazine depth that you're going to have with the Virginia and the VPM. But our thought was, base them forward, base them in Guam and Japan or in the Baltics, and so they are close to the fight. And then when the balloon goes up, flush them out early because it's going to take them a while to get there. And the Virginias and the nuclear submarines that are deploying from CONUS or from other locations can speed into the AOR and get on station very quickly. Once they're on station, there's something that the adversary is going to have to worry about. And so the thought there was this is a way of actually increasing the size of the submarine force relatively cheaply, because you can buy, our back of the envelope math suggests you could get 3 diesels for the cost of 1 Virginia. So it's a way of increasing it quickly to try to overcome the loss of the Los Angeles class as they retire out of the force.
Thank you. That's all I have. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. Okay, we're going to go to a very brief recess. We've sent some members off to vote. They're going to come back. Mr. Conaway will take the chair as we head off to vote, so we'll be back and continue the hearing. So just hang in there with us for a few minutes. We're trying to navigate these votes. So we will recess briefly.
in terms of supporting the concept of distributed lethality in the future?
Thank you, sir. Admiral Fanta was chairing a meeting I was at this morning. I think there's a distinction to be made in our force structure. So we have 28 LCS. We need those. We use those for mine countermeasure missions and anti-submarine warfare missions. We don't trade those against other ships. We also have 20 small surface combatants. We need those ships. Those would be doing part of the anti-surface battle network. So we have 48 requirement for 48 small combatants, 28, which is the number that we have currently under contract for LCS. We need every one of those. We also see a need for 20 more of the small surface combatant to extend our distributed lethal network. So I just wanted, it's not 48 of the same ship.
Well, on that point, Mr. Clark, I'd ask you to talk about this. Is there a need for a more survivable and lethal frigate than now being considered by the Navy acquisition strategy? Or what requirements need to be built in that don't currently exist in the LCS program as we look towards a frigate of the future?
Yes, thanks, Congressman. So I think we definitely recommended a larger, more survivable, and more lethal frigate going forward. So in our fleet architecture, we recommended that the Navy continue to build the LCS and the frigate version of the LCS until that design is ready to be built, which we anticipated not happening until the 2020 timeframe. And then we would transition to that frigate. We think the essential capabilities needed in that frigate are the ability to do air defense for another ship, so it could do escort missions, which we saw in our analysis as being an increasingly important mission for a situation in which our logistics forces and civilian convoys and non-combatant ships are going to be at risk of being attacked by an enemy that's willing to go all out and attack civilians as well as attacking just strictly military ships. So we saw the need to have the ability to do air defense of another ship as being essential. The other thing it has to be able to do is anti-submarine warfare, and in particular using new anti-submarine warfare concepts that will leverage things like the variable depth sonar that the LCS mission package has, and the the multifunction towed array, which the LCS mission package has as well. What those capabilities do is allow us to transition from having a strictly man-on-man or single ship on submarine kind of ASW to now do multi-static ASW where multiple ships can look for multiple submarines, and then we need standoff weapons to be able to engage those submarines rapidly, which could be from a turn type of unmanned vehicle that an LCS or frigate could deploy. But those capabilities that we need in that frigate end up requiring a ship that's larger than the LCSs that we currently are building.
And Dr. Banerjee, you seem to, is it fair to say you disagree kind of with both those approaches? Your report argues for the cancellation of the program. Have you done any analysis of what that would do to the defense industrial base? Because I'm sure you know this isn't sort of a turn it off and turn the spigot on somewhere else. I mean, this is years of developing a skilled workforce and improvements and efficiencies that happen every single day to make it more affordable.
Roger that. To the first part of the question, we agree with CSBA. I think we agree that it has to be a larger frigate, larger size. We did look, and we were looking at, again, an area air defense, anti-surface warfare capability that was built around the hypervelocity projectile launched out of a 5-inch gun. I mean, the first part of analysis that we did was look at, okay, what kind of frigate designs do that? It turns out there was a Garcia-class frigate back in the 80s. That was a 3,500 ton, so it's about LCS size. It had two 5-inch deck guns. The naval architect that was on our team didn't think that that was something that was although it was done back then, that it was something that was doable today. So we had actually recommended something that was a larger size. I think we looked at a German F-125, which is a 7,200 ton frigate design that had the two deck guns, could get you some VLS cells as well as EW capabilities and decoys and things you would need to make that a much more robust and survivable ship within this particular threat environment. Now, the question in terms of whether or not that could be built in those shipyards and whether those yards could be expanded to handle a larger ship size, that wasn't something that we looked at. What we did think about was whether it would be possible to actually potentially license a design to try to actually get something built sooner. If it's a design that could be licensed and then manufactured at either or both of the existing LCS shipyards. Now, what modifications that they would have to do at the yards to be able to do that, we didn't actually look at that. The other potential option, I mean, we did also talk about a couple different alternatives for the amphibious force, one of that would be an option to build a smaller a number of smaller platforms for the new dock ship. Now, I know since the study came out, I think there's been a decision as to what that design is going to be. But if the Navy and the Marine Corps wanted to go down that road, then that could potentially be another ship that's built within the existing shipyards and facilities.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your work. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Norcross, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And hopefully you didn't address this while I was going voting, but I hear more diverse, spread our risk out, hidden, unmanned. Tell me how our aircraft carriers fit into this new world and new vision that you have been talking about. So start right with the Admiral and work our way down.
Well, so I'd like to defer to the study team leads and let them explain how they incorporated our existing carriers and how they're planning on using either an America class or some alternate carrier in the future force.
Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. I think one of the key parts of our study that really hasn't gotten the visibility is the synergy that you can have between a large aircraft carrier like a Nimitz or a Ford and a big deck amphib. One thing that doesn't get publicized too well is the Marines are far ahead of the Navy in terms of fielding fifth-gen fighters. The F-35 Bravo will be out in numbers before the F-35 Charlie is. So the big deck amphib, which can host up to 23 35 Bravos, probably wouldn't want to deploy that many for operational reasons, but it could host, say, 20. It could go to sea and provide 2 extra squadrons of fifth-gen fighters, which the Navy couldn't field until 2026 at current acquisition plans. However, it can't carry AEW, Advanced Early Warning, Airborne Early Warning. It can't have electronic attack. So you wouldn't want it to be out by itself, but if you put it out with the big deck carrier, there's a win-win, because now the carrier air wing has fifth-gen squadrons earlier, and the L-class ship affords the protection from the E-2s and the Growlers that are on the big carrier. So when we said we had so many more combat nodes, when we deploy for combat, we send carriers out in twos. The reason for that is you have to have 24/7 flight ops, and you have to have downtime on the flight deck. So if I have to send my carriers out in twos, I can cut the number of strike groups in half that I can send to war. If I pair them up with big deck amphibs, I'm back to each carrier can be a strike group with an L-class ship next to it.
But the point I'm trying to make is they're larger, you're not going to hide them. If it does break out, what are the chances of that surviving the first 10 minutes of any conflict?
It's large, sir, and it's hard to hide, but it's also hard to find. Remember, it's mobile. And so, big Pacific Ocean, I can know a carrier's there, but I have to get its location within the acquisition circle of my missile, and I have to transmit that data to a firing unit before that circle grows. You know, at 30 knots, I know where your carrier is right now. Go call the missile shop, get them to shoot something. Every minute, that circle is growing area of uncertainty because the carrier is doing 30 knots. And so what you really want to do is say, you may know I have a carrier there, but you can't solve the firing solution and you can't launch on it. And so all those things we've been talking about, the decoys, the electronic warfare, the cyber, that's to keep the uncertainty. They may know we have a carrier out there, but unless they can put a weapon on it, it doesn't help.
Thank you.
So one thing I'd say in addition to that is it also depends how you use your carrier. If you use your carrier as the front line of defense and deterrence, then you're putting it into an environment where it's much more likely to be found, targeted, and shot at. And what we found in our analysis is not so much that the carrier gets sunk, is that its operations get suppressed because it's driving around trying to avoid being shot, and it's not able to launch aircraft, and therefore it's not really doing its job. So what we did in our fleet architecture study is we took the carriers, which are very good at delivering combat power at moderate levels for a really long period of time, and moving them outside that immediate area of the conflict where things might start. So you think about the South and East China Seas and in the Western Pacific. And we put the distributed forces that we've been talking about inside that area because they have missile-based fires that are much faster and can be delivered in high volume for a short period. So in a war, these distributed forces we're talking about are likely to use up all their weapons relatively quickly. So within a few days, they might be out of ammunition and have to sort of withdraw, or they get attacked and sunk. So we need somebody to be able to flow in behind them to be able to continue the fight once those distributed forces have to start withdrawing. And that's what the carrier strike groups are able to do. One, they're a little bit farther away, so they're able to maneuvering, take advantage of the larger space they have at their disposal, so they're harder to find. And they're also then coming in at a point where we've maybe started to attrite the enemy a little bit and reduced his ability to launch large salvos at the carrier. So separating the force into these forward forces and this larger carrier-based force enables you to take advantage of what both do really well and minimize the chance that the carrier would be suppressed.
But you also have to keep them outside of the range, so they're going to stay out in the North Atlantic in case the Balkans, or particularly when we're dealing down there.
Right, so they stay outside the immediate area of the conflict, so they could still be attacked by some small number of very, very long-range weapons, but you don't put them in the place where necessarily they're going to be able to be hit by large numbers of shorter-range weapons.
In the MITRE study, we talk about using the hypervelocity projectile to basically use the surface combatants to protect the carrier from the cruise missile threats, and we also talk about an aerial layer missile system to try to engage the more capable hypersonic threats, as well as trying to actually shoot down the bombers and the strategic aircraft that they're going to launch those things off of at range. So we use that to try to protect the carrier and provide kind of a layered defense that's more robust and can be layered on top of the existing standard missile systems and existing point defense systems within the strike group. To get to the unmanned question, I think the interesting question there is if you're on a combat air patrol where you're trying to perform this mission, that is actually a fairly nice role to actually have for an unmanned system, because they can stay up there for a prolonged period of time, and it's a relatively boring job for a fighter jock to do. But then actually slave the fire control for that system back to either the E-2D or back to an Aegis combatant to actually perform, put that cap up while you're not conducting large-scale flight operations. It's an interesting potential role for unmanned systems for carrier defense.
Thank you. We yield back.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Norcross. We'll now go to Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. And if I ask any of the same questions, please excuse me. I'm coming from a vote. So this is for Rear Admiral as well as Mr. Werchado. I'm sort of confused as to what the right number is for you, for the Navy, because the FSA in December 2016 said 355, and some of you are concurring or nodding to 355. But in your report, you seem to go to a total of 457, manned 321, which is for 355, that number, and unmanned 136. So what is the number? What is Navy's position?
Yes, ma'am. Let me clarify a little bit, and I've mentioned this earlier, but as you mentioned, you may not have been in the room then. 355 was the results of the force structure assessment, and that relates to current programs of record, current platforms that the Navy has using current warfighting concepts, and keeping things fixed such as our strategic laydown that we currently have. Now, that is the foundation and the baseline for where we need to go in the future. So right now, that number is 355, but as we look to future fleet architectures, different concepts of fighting, different platforms. So within that 355 number, there are no unmanned platforms. So if you look at how you're fighting in a more distributed fashion, how your forces are more netted and integrated, now you have an opportunity to replace some manned platforms with some unmanned platforms, for example, and some other things that are have different technologies. And then you're going to fight those things a different way. So that number will look different. One of the things that drives us to do a force structure assessment is change in strategy, a significant change in programmatics. This is one example if you're going to a more unmanned kind of centric force, and significant changes in the threat. And that's what drove the 2016, significant changes in the threat, and there was a change in the strategy. That's what drove the increase of the number. Any of those changes that happen in the future, it will change the number again. We will do another force structure assessment, and it will reflect what a future force would need to look like.
I understand that, but the problem with doing that is that if you, we can't, and then basically the industrial base can't switch that simply. So, for example, one of the things that I noticed, which is dear to Hawaii, is the fact that where everyone else seems to agree that the Virginia-class attack sub should be around 66, one of you is higher than 66, you're not. In terms of the Navy system is not. The FSA is at 66. And we're also at the same number, I believe, in the Columbia-class subs. So it seems to me that one of the things that I'd like to know, first of all, is who do you perceive to be the, quote, enemy that you have to fight? Because if it is Russia and China, as many of you allude to or actually state, then we shouldn't have this kind of a discrepancy in my mind. We should have some understanding of one, where is that force going to be? Is it going to be in the Pacific? Is it going to be under the Arctic? Or is it going to be in the Atlantic? So if you could, one of you could answer that.
Yes, ma'am. I think there's an apparent disconnect that isn't. So Admiral Wilson said he looked at manned platforms in the force structure assessment. You get 66. MITRE looked at a mixture of nuke and diesel. And if you add the two, we had 53 SSNs, but we also had 48 large displacement UUVs. So whether you do it all through manned nuke and manned diesel, or manned nuke and unmanned diesel, I think what you're really talking about is a capability. And I love the fact that you went from asking about the total force structure number to the individual submarine number. Inside the Pentagon, we never say 313, 325, 355, because it's not a meaningful number. We say, how many carriers do I need? How many amphibs do I need? How many submarines do I need? That's where the discussion really should take place. Thank you, ma'am.
So what about my question about where is the threat? I assume all of this is driven by where is the threat. So it's got to be some assessment on all of your parts as to who or where is that threat.
In order to keep it unclassified, we specified we would be able to handle a high-end threat with large anti-access capability. My colleague named two countries that I wouldn't disagree with.
Somebody named them, I read it.
Yes, ma'am, I can. But while doing that, deter anyone else. So that could be the next level tier of country. So if you can handle one of the big ones, you should be able to handle one of the medium ones and keep them deterred.
Yeah.
That was our construct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Hanabusa. We'll now go to Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Up until December 31st, I was just a small-town lawyer trying to make good, and now I'm trying to learn all these newfangled concepts. And Admiral, you and I had a discussion the other day, and I went and did a little research, and it turns out that I think we're working under the assumption that we have to fight at least two. We need to be prepared to fight two significant conflicts, maybe one with a non-state actor, maybe one with a state actor. And that's what drives our preparedness numbers, and that's what drives, presumably, this 355 number or some variation. And then I see my president proposes $54 billion to be added in investment to defense. And then he flies down just outside of my district into Newport News, stands on a carrier, and starts talking about how wonderful this amount of money is for building up presumably our Navy. That is certainly the implication. And then I start hearing all these whispers about, well, the $54 billion really isn't all for the Navy. It's for, most of it, quite frankly, is going to the Department of Energy for our nuclear weapons systems. I don't know if any of that's true. I don't want to deal with alternative facts. If anybody at this table knows, how much of that $54 billion would actually be going to building ships, hopefully out of Newport News and Connecticut and maybe elsewhere too. But how much of that $54 billion will actually be going to building ships?
Yes, sir. I can't comment on specifically how much money would be going towards building ships, but some of that money will go towards making the current force whole, and some of it will go towards ramping up and building the ships. But specific dollar figure I can't give you here.
I appreciate it, and thank you for gently chiding me in that fashion. To the extent that you can comment, does any part of that $54 billion put us on track to get to that 355 ship level, because I got a whole bunch of folks who are looking for work in Virginia's 4th Congressional District, and they're getting mighty excited. And I'm hearing things that say we need to slow down. We're not going to get there too quickly with that number.
No, absolutely, Congressman. We will be, well, there's efforts ongoing right now to see what we can do to ramp up in the industrial base where we can and start moving quickly to that 355 number for platforms that we know we're going to need.
Yes, sir. Also, the Secretary of Defense indicated his priority would be first restoring readiness, then fixing holes in the programs, and then growing force structure. I would just point out that a lot of restoring readiness means Norfolk Naval Shipyard, because we do have to do the repairs to those ships to get them back out. So I would expect a lot of the investment would be going to increase the rate of overhauls and the capacity to do overhauls.
Also keeping in mind that the ship maintenance industrial base would benefit from some of this money going into readiness, because right now all of our surface combatants, all of our amphibious ships get maintained at private shipyards. There's a bunch in Norfolk, there's a bunch along the East Coast, and so there's a lot of workers that are going to be brought in to help with that, because that's where a lot of our expansion volume is, if you will, in the ship maintenance industrial base.
If you care to comment, you don't need to feel compelled.
No, I don't know where that $54 billion is going. I don't have anything to say on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McEachin. Just wanted to let you know, too, we've asked the Congressional Budget Office to outline for us the pathway to get to 355 ships in a 15, 20, 25, and 30-year scenario. So we'll have some additional information for the committee as far as the pathway there. So it'll give you a little more information to go on. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel for your testimony here today. Admiral, thank you for your service, and all of you, the work that you're doing on behalf of our nation. Thank you for your work. Admiral Wilson, Mr. Werchado, so I'm a longtime member of the subcommittee, and I'm very proud to represent Rhode Island's 2nd District, where we begin the build process for our nation's submarine fleet. So I have to say, though, I'm frustrated that such a dramatic increase to our naval fleet from 274 to 355 ships in the future was announced so quickly, it seemed, without very little conversation. So can you discuss with the subcommittee the decision-making process that took place prior to this announcement, and what factors were most heavily weighted, and how are you preparing to move forward now with this plan? I think it caught a lot of people off guard that it happened so quickly, and I've been around here for a while, and to see that kind of a dramatic shift so quickly was surprising. So
yes, sir. I think you're referring to the announcement of the 355 ship
right.
Navy.
Yeah.
I would answer that by saying that our study was complete, and we had brief leadership. And so once you have a completed study and you brief leadership, leadership then has it's their prerogative on whether they want to go public with it or not. And the Secretary of the Navy chose to go public with that information, which was complete at the time.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Werchado, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that covered it. I just point out that the work for the FSA actually started under Admiral Wilson's predecessor, Admiral Werchado. It took us about almost a year. So we had to go out to all the fleet component commanders and the COCOMs and find out what their demand signal was. We compared it to the results of our campaign modeling, the analysis we do for the war plan. So it was an involved process. It may have seemed overnight based on the speed of the rollout, but again, that was SECNAV determined. We'd been working pretty much since last January on it.
Okay. All right, thank you. Dr. Banerjee, so I see that the MITRE study included the addition of an electromagnetic railgun on board a new frigate and supplemental platforms. So I've been a long-time advocate for things like directed energy and high-velocity projectile technologies. And I understand that high-velocity projectiles have been discussed today already, but did you evaluate directed energy technologies outside of railgun in your study? If not, why not?
No, we didn't look at things like the solid-state laser technology maturation program and some of the other systems that are out there. I think our thought is that those are interesting technologies we should continue to invest in. I think that there's still a capability there potentially from a counter C4ISR perspective, but our thought was that the hypervelocity projectile was further along in something that was, at least when launched from a 5-inch deck gun, could be deployed within the existing force. In terms of the railgun, our thought was if practical, if you could put the power plant in to be able to operate it in the new frigate design, that would be great. The other option that we put forward was potentially in the magazine ship concept, if you're actually going to put VLS cells and other capabilities into a commercial hull. In a commercial hull, you can buy containerized power plants that could deliver that type of power for a railgun, and you could drop them in, and that might be the quickest way to actually get something like that to the fleet. We were focused on what could be done in the next 10 to 15 years, and I think our concern is, although I know SSLTM and other capabilities are moving forward, we just weren't sure you were going to get the power level out of those systems to have effects against the types of systems that we're worried about.
Okay. All right. I mean, I would just point out that we do have a 30 kilowatt laser right now on the USS Ponce that's in theater. We don't have a railgun in theater yet. I know it's only a 30 kilowatt, but we're certainly experimenting with an actual platform. So.
So for that, I mean, to go against a FAC-FIAC type threat or small boat threat or a UAV threat, I think you can get away with. I mean, the question is though, in the when we're talking about the South China Sea and dealing with those the types of platforms that they're going to launch out at us, and the ranges that we're going to be operating at, is that what impact is it going to have in that particular fight?
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, Congressman, I'll rise in defense of directed energy, but we included in our study both the solid-state laser, because in the 2030 timeframe, it's completely realistic to think that you could have a 150 to 300 kilowatt laser that you could use, and then also high-power radio frequency or high-power microwave could be an effective technology in that timeframe. So we included both in our study.
Okay. Thank you. I have another question I'd like to submit for the record, but no,
Very good.
time is tight and my time is expired, so I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. We appreciate our witnesses here. We do have to get down to the floor and vote on FY17 Department of Defense appropriations, so I think we want to make sure we get down there and do that. So I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We deeply appreciate your perspectives, and we will continue the conversation about future fleet architecture. Thanks again. We are adjourned.